В год 6370 изгнали варяг за море, и не дали им дани, и начали сами собой владеть, и не было среди них правды. И встал род на род, и была у них усобица, и стали воевать друг с другом. И сказали себе: поищем себе князя, который бы владел нами и судил по праву. И пошли за море к варягам, к Руси. Те варяги назывались Русью, как другие называются шведы, а иные норманы и англы, а еще иные готландцы. Вот так и эти. Сказали Руси чуть, славенец, привечен и весь.
6368,
Земля наша велика и
6370.
обильна, а
The
порядка
tributaries of the
имеет.
Varangians drove them
Приходите,
back
княже,
beyond the sea, and,
и избрали
refusing
себе
them further
братьев
tribute, set
своими,
out to govern
и
themselves.
взяли с собой
There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war one against another. They said to themselves, let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law. They accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Rus. These particular Varangians were known as Rus, just as some are called Swedes and others Normans, English, and Gotlanders, for they were thus named. The Chudes, the Slavs, the Kravitians, and the Vests then said to the people of Rus, our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. They thus selected 3 brothers, with their kinsfolk, who took them with all the Rus and migrated. The oldest, Rurik, located himself in Novgorod, the second, Sinuus, at Belaozero, and the third, Truvor, in Izborsk. On account of these Varangians, it became known as the Land of Rus.
On 6th September 1749, the imperial historian Gerhard Friedrich Müller stepped out into the Imperial Academy of Sciences to deliver a lecture on the origins of Russia, entitled Origines Gentis et Nominis Russorum. Building on research a fellow German, Gottlieb Siegfried Bayer, had published in the previous decade, Müller began setting out how ancient Rus had been founded by Norsemen. He did not finish his speech. Furious Russians in the hall shouted him down, accusing him of dishonoring the nation, and so began a debate that has raged ever since. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 22, Normanists and Anti-Normanists. Thank you to new patron Gate and my new Apple subscribers this month. There's a new member episode out on Cyril and Methodius and the beginnings of Slavic literacy. If you'd like to get access to that and other exclusive episodes, you can join up on patreon.com/The Russian Empire History Podcast. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts, or for Spotify listeners, sign up through Anchor. Your support is greatly appreciated. You're probably finding this episode a little bit late, and that's true. My aim is to put out 2 30 to 45 minute episodes and a member episode each month. But both September's member episode and this one turned out to be oversized, so that didn't quite work out. A normal episode is 4.5 to 6,000 words, but these two are both 10,000. At the head of this episode, you heard an extract from the Tale of Bygone Years, describing the events of 859 to 860, when the Slavs allegedly invited a people called the Rus to rule them. But who were the Rus? That is the question that has caused so much trouble since the first attempts to write Russian history, and is the first great controversy of our story, a controversy that continues to be litigated to this day, amid accusations of cultural chauvinism, stolen heritage, nationalism, and imperialism. Before we dive back into the story, this episode will survey some of these debates and the contentious issues, the historiography of the Rus question, which has two main schools: the Normanists, who support the idea that the Rus were Scandinavian Varangians, Eastern Vikings, who came to the Slavs and took over their leadership before Slavicizing themselves, and the Anti-Normanists, who say that even if the Varangians were present in Rus, they played no significant role in the Slavs creating their own state. The Norman theory was first elaborated by Bayer, Müller, and another German, Schlürzer, members of the St. Petersburg Academy of Science in the late 18th century. The tale of bygone years, as illustrated by the passage we opened with, was one of their key sources, and they surmised that the Normans, meaning Norsemen from Scandinavia, no direct connection to Western European Normans who got their name in the same way, had begun to establish a state on Lake Ilmen near Novgorod, later expanding south to Kiev and present-day Ukraine. The theory was immediately controversial due to the ethnic origin of the historians, who were accused of denying the Slavs' ability to form their own state. This remains a sore point, which might seem a bit strange to those of us from English-speaking countries, as the idea of more advanced Normans conquering England and turning the primitive English into a proper medieval feudal society is not especially controversial. But we have had centuries of royal propaganda celebrating the conquest. If it had been forgotten until some Frenchmen turned up at the Royal Society in 1780 and presented their theory, people might feel differently. But regardless of the initial opposition, with time many did come to accept the theory, and it was expanded and advanced by major historians in Russia and elsewhere throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, undergoing modification from the idea of Varangians marching in and taking over to a gradual peaceful Norman colonization, with the Varangians becoming the local elite and then Slavicizing as their polities developed. The Normanists argued that the name Rus came from the Finnish word Ruotsi, which means Sweden, where Sweden's main seafaring region in medieval times was Roslagen, whose inhabitants were Roskala. Against this, the Normanists assert that there was no tribe called the Rus in Scandinavia or in the Old Norse sagas. Of course, we've heard in previous episodes about the complete absence of early evidence of anyone calling themselves Slavs, a people of equally mysterious origins. So this is hardly the killer argument that anti-Normanists seem to think it is sometimes. We've heard quite a lot from the Islamic sources, and in case you missed it, they do distinguish quite clearly between the Rus and the Shakaliba, the Slavs. This is also reflected in the Byzantine sources, such as the De Administrando Imperio, written in the mid-10th century, which lists the name of rapids on the Dnieper requiring portage in both Slavic and Rus variants. There are a lot of arguments about the significance and derivation of these names. Around 839, the Byzantine Emperor Theophilus sent some envoys from a people calling themselves the Rus onto the Carolingian Emperor Louis I in Ingelheim, asking for assistance sending them home as they were at risk of attack on the road. Louis recognized the Rus as Swedes. Anti-Normanists claimed that these were merely some Swedes working for the Slavic Rus rulers. For Ukrainian historians, the idea of the autochthonic origins of the Slavic people in Ukrainian lands, that is, that they emerged themselves without outside influence, has always been highly important, and Normanism was more controversial there even than it was in Russia, not only in terms of their origins, but also because of how those origins related to Russia, and therefore what they meant for the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. In his single-volume history of Ukraine, the great Ukrainian statesman and historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, president of the Independent Republic of Ukraine, declared as the empire collapsed in 1917, wrote, quote, "The foregoing account," here he's referring to the passage read at the start of the podcast, "is given by an annalist who made alterations in the original Kievan Chronicle, which has been accepted at face value by later historians. But the story calls for questioning. The conjecture of the ancient chronicler that the name Rus was brought by the Varangians from Sweden cannot be correct. We do not know the origin of the word and should not attempt to guess at an answer. At this time, anarchy reigned in Norway and Sweden, and the resultant spirit of restlessness caused many chiefs and their followers to move into other lands to establish themselves as rulers or enter the service of others. Because there were so many Scandinavians in the Kievan state, the entire country was often regarded as Scandinavian or Norse, and for this reason the Kievan chronicler, as already said, invented the fiction that the name Rus had been brought from Sweden." End quote. In my edition published by the Ukrainian National Association, the editors thought that this position was controversial enough that it was worth inserting the only editor's note in the book, stating, quote, "As the following constitutes one of the fundamental arguments of Ukrainian nationalists, and the whole problem of the Rus is still being debated, Professor Hrushevsky's statement appears here in its original form." End quote. The book itself has the title A History of Ukraine in English on the cover, but underneath it says Istoria Ukraini Rusi, or A History of Ukraine Rus in Ukrainian, which reflects his position that Rus was a part of Ukrainian history alone. But don't take this as a simple Russian-Ukrainian division. Some Ukrainian historians have downplayed the Normanist theory as unnecessary, asserting that the Slavic settlements on the Dnieper in Galicia and Volhynia were already progressing to statehood before any Varangians arrived. But others have supported the Normanists. They and other historians in Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere have continued to work on the Normanist theory, bringing new discoveries into ideas about what and where Rus was. Some anti-Normanists initially attacked the Normanist theory as anti-patriotic, despite the obvious drawback that it involved the Normans being completely assimilated by their Slavic subjects. They tie the adoption of the Normanist theory as essentially the official position in the late Russian Empire to the allegedly alien nature of its rulers. The direct masculine line of the Romanovs ended with Peter II. The last of the female side to reign was Elizabeth Petrovna, who was the empress at the time Muller gave his speech. After an investigation following the speech, she forbade him to continue his research, and he decided to pursue the history of Siberia instead. But from her death to the 1917 revolution, the officially Romanov Tsars, critics grumbled, were more German than Russian. Peter III, grandson of Peter the Great, was born in Kiel and preferred his German heritage. His wife, Catherine the Great, was born in Germany. Their son, Paul I, married another German, Sophia of Württemberg. Their son, Alexander I, married another German, Louisa of Baden. And their son, Nicholas I married another German, and so on, all the way down to Nicholas II and Alicia of Hessen. Attentive readers will have noted many German names among imperial scholars and officials mentioned in the podcast, and this is not just a superficial opinion. Although only 1% of the population, at the end of the 19th century, Germans accounted for 57% of officials in the Foreign Ministry, 46% in the Ministry of Defense, 62% at the Ministry of Post and Communications. This played into the Slavophile Westernizer debate, as some thought that the Germanic origins of Rus were being used to justify German rule of the Russian Empire. After the revolution, the pendulum swung the other way. State ideology now supported native origins, and the Normanist position was seen as harmful. The party line was generally anti-Normanist, but at the same time, an enormous amount of highly important archaeological work was carried out in the Soviet Union, which continues to inform the work of modern historians. Outside of Russia, the Normanist theory has become widely accepted, and many of you will have probably heard of Rurik and the Scandinavians that were involved in the origins of Rus. But despite widespread acceptance, many of the issues remain open questions. First, there's that word Rus. Rather than being an import from the north, anti-Normanists claim that it is a Slavic word that had already been in use for centuries. To support this, they make the following arguments. Eastern Slavs never called the Vikings Rus. They called them Varyagi, Varangians. The Islamic writers describe Rus as a kingdom on the middle Dnieper, around Kiev, at a date before the Varangians arrive. The lands inhabited by the Polyanians include the river Ros, not far away from Kiev. Early texts from other Eastern Slav cities refer to going to Rus, or coming from Rus, or fighting Rus, when they mean Kiev, or at most the southern part of what gets called Rus, but not other city-states like Vladimir or Pskov. A Ukrainian historian, Mikhailo Maximovich, advanced the theory of the connection between the river Ros and the Rus back in 1837, citing a number of other rivers in the region, such as the Rosava, Rusna, and Rostavitsia. In his telling, the Varangians were merely a warband within a Slavic proto-state, and a multi-ethnic warband at that, with as many Slavs as Swedes. Others have put forward an Iranian theory, connecting Rus to the Roxolani. Actually, all those rivers with a Don name that have come up so frequently in the podcast, the Don, of course, but also the Donets, Dnieper, Dniester, Danube, and others, have an Iranian name. Don means water. This theory was largely rejected due to difficulties moving the Roxolani from the Don to the area around Kiev, and modern genetic studies don't support an Iranian origin. These arguments aren't really any more or less persuasive than Rus coming from Scandinavia. If you say that there's a river in southern Ukraine with a name that sounds like Rus, and therefore the Rus came from there, there's still the question of why Novgorod was Rus. Both arguments tend to be believed in the absence of further evidence because of the starting position of the people who hold them. If we turn to the tale of bygone years, we can find plenty to criticize, as is usually the case with medieval chronicles. It was only written about 300 years after the events it is claiming to describe, so there are anachronistic details all over the place. One good example is how it throws in the English as one of the tribes of Varangians. This was very much not the case in the 9th century, but later on there were many English serving in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, which the chronicler would have known about. Rurik arrives with his two brothers, Cineas and Truvor, just like Key and his brothers who founded Kiev. Those tales of triple brother founders were all over the place, which of course suggests that they are based on an accepted storytelling tropes of the time, rather than fact. The tale also says that the Rus and Slavs spoke the same language. Strange if they had been Slavs and Scandinavians, but not strange for those already fully assimilated by the time the tales were written. Some scholars have looked for an explanation of these and other points in the tale in the alleged political purpose of the tale. Rather than telling a true origin story, which would in this case supposedly be about Slavs in southern Rus, it is an attempt to legitimate Novgorod's claims to seniority and independence from Kiev. This approach was particularly popular in Soviet times. The anti-Normanist position does not reject the idea that the Rus, centered on Kiev, had any connection with Scandinavia. On the contrary, they paint a picture of extensive relations with the North, but these relations involve trade, Scandinavians in military service to Slav rulers of Rus, and marriages between Rus and Scandinavian aristocracy. For them, the key issue is that the early Rus were East Slavic by nature and culture, that their rise to statehood was independent and self-motivated, rather than imposed by external forces, and whether any individual princeling was a Viking of Norse origin was therefore immaterial. In the early days of the debate, anti-Normanists also claimed that there was no archaeological evidence for Scandinavians in Rus. But archaeology never stands still, and that argument has grown weaker with time. In more recent times, some scholars have seen the Scandinavian Slav debate as too narrow or missing the point. Thomas Noonan, the historian who investigated the hordes of Arab coins that we have previously mentioned when talking about the Khazar trade, rather sees the Rus as growing out of a multi-ethnic trade conglomeration, trying to control the Eastern European routes of exchange and coming under the influence of Byzantium, Orthodox Christianity, and the Eastern Slavic tribes. Historian Omelian Pritsak argued for a greater role of the Khazars. In his theory, Kiev itself was founded by the Khazars before the Normans arrived to lead the Slavic tribes to freedom from the Khazar yoke. The first Varangians to arrive at Byzantium called their king the Khagan, using the title of the rulers of Khazaria. Kiev and Vienna developed as cities on the trade route from the Franks to the Khazars. And in the tale of bygone years, we find that the Polyanians tell the Varangians that three brothers built the town, and now they pay tribute to the brothers' kinsmen, the Khazars. In this theory, the Normans were initially allied with the Khazar trading partners, but as they intermarried with the Slavs, adopted Slavic culture, and became Christianized, they became increasingly hostile to the Khazars, with Normans and Slavs eventually joining together to overthrow the Khaganate. The tale of bygone years was only written centuries after these events, although it clearly preserves existing traditions. Earlier manuscripts are referenced, but none have survived. The tale itself is dated to as early as 1116, but that version has been lost. It exists now in several codexes. The Laurentian Codex, dating from 1377, is a Northern Rus compilation that covers Suzdal up to 1305. The Hypatian Codex, from the early 15th century, is a Southern Rus compilation covering Kiev and Galicia-Volhynia up to 1292. There is also a Novgorod compilation from the mid-14th century dealing with the northwest of Rus. According to the tale, the tribes ruled by the Rus were not only Slavs, there were also the Chud, Meria, Ves, Muroma, Cheremis, and Mordva, Finno-Ugrian peoples. We'll discuss what the chronicles say more organically as we move through the story, but the key point to keep in mind is the arguments around the political purposes of the various chronicles. That is, scholars will claim that various contradictions and inconsistencies, semi-legendary tales and origin stories in the chronicles, are not down to differences in historical information, but rather linked to claims of dynastic legitimacy, political independence, or other factors. The other sources on Rus, Arab, Persian, Byzantine, and Scandinavian writers, are also contradictory, and both Normanists and Anti-Normanists have found plenty of material to support their theories. Here, the causes of the discrepancies are easier to parse out. The lands of Eastern Europe are remote. Some writers, such as Ibn Fadlan, are describing their own experiences in a particular area, but also setting down what their contacts tell them about other places where they haven't been. Other writers are retelling earlier works that have been lost. They did not visit Eastern Europe themselves, and it's not clear whether their sources did. So their writings need to be correlated with sources we know of firsthand. Other writings are based on eyewitness testimony, such as the De Administrado Imperia and Norse sagas. But as the writer is working based on these reports, we do not know the exact extent of the first-hand experience, where sources have exaggerated, or where they're passing on third-hand information. The Norse sagas contain many references to Holmgarder, the Norse name for Novgorod, but few to Konungarder, Kiev. But the Byzantine sources say that Kinungarder was where the people from the north gathered on the way south, and where they split up on their way back north, a gateway to the wealth of the south for Varangians on their way to Miklagard, Constantinople, Turkland, Khazaria, or Cirkland, the Caliphate. The Aemunda saga contains a description of negotiations between Yaroslav and Varangians offering to enter his service and assist him in his rivalry with Svyatopolk. The Varangians first demand to be paid in silver, but Yaroslav rejects this as too expensive. The Varangians then propose being paid in beaver and sable skins, goods which abound in your land, which Yaroslav finds acceptable. While there are quite a few written sources from most of the Rus neighbours in most directions, I think it is easy to see why there might be discrepancies between Norse tales focused on Novgorod and travel southwards through Kiev, and Islamic travellers going south to north along the Volga through lands that were not under Slavic domination. So comparative readings, linguistic analysis, and archaeological discoveries have led historians to a variety of interpretations, and although it might appear today that the Normanist theory is prevailing, particularly in the West, there is still far from total agreement. 80 years ago, Nicholas Ryazanovsky, who would go on to teach Russian history at the University of California, Berkeley for decades, criticized the lack of attention to the controversy in the West. Quote, "Most of the literature on the subject, which is available in Western languages, and in English in particular, strikes one as being one-sidedly and extremely Normanist. Practically no anti-Normanist works are available in any language but Russian." End quote. In Ryazanovsky's interpretation, the Normanist theory, quote, claimed that the entire Russian culture, religion, customs, political structure, law, art, owed its origin and the first 2 centuries of its development to the Scandinavians, Normans. This astounding theory could exist only as long as the ignorance of Russian antiquity was practically complete. End quote. Notwithstanding such claims of Normanist dominance, we can still find a wide range of opinion on what the extent of Rus was, who the Rus were, and what their relationship to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus was, even among those scholars who accept a Normanist theory. So, although I usually try to avoid overloading you with names, here is a brief survey. Despite this being the longest episode so far, it's far from complete, probably misses out a couple of dozen scholars and arguments worth considering. Some of them will be covered in upcoming episodes on the Rus. I already quoted Mikhailo Khrushchevsky's view above, which had a significant impact on Ukrainian views of their national history, and I'm sure I'll have plenty of reason to reference him again in this podcast, from his views on early Ukraine through to his contributions to the Ukrainian struggle for independence. Khrushchevsky, who lived from 1866 to 1934, was born in Holm, then part of Ukraine, now Helm in Poland, and studied history at Kiev University. He became a teacher at the university himself, but his promotion of Ukrainian cultural identity and language caused conflict with the administration during this period of official Russification and suppression of the Ukrainian language. So he moved to the University of Lviv, then Lemberg, in Austrian Western Ukraine. His life's work was the 10-volume A History of Ukraine, in which he got as far as 1658 before his death. Khrushchevsky became the president of the Republic of Ukraine at its declaration of independence as the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, before being forced to flee after German occupation. He returned in 1924, but was expelled in 1930 and died in exile. Khrushchevsky considered that Kiev had already achieved a higher level of cultural and organizational development than Scandinavia in the Viking Age. He argued that instability in Scandinavia drove them to seek opportunity elsewhere, which was why so many of them ended up in service to Slavic leaders. Indeed, so many of them ended up in the armies of Ukrainian leaders that foreign countries sometimes confused the Rus with Scandinavians, and this led the writer of the Kievan Chronicle to invent the theory that the Varangians brought the Rus name from Sweden. It is obviously problematic for this approach that so many of the Rus aristocracy have Scandinavian names, Igor, Olga, Oleg, all derived from names of Norse gods. But, says Khrushchevsky, these merely came from the leaders of the bands of Varangian warriors taken into service. Khrushchevsky was working in a period where national consciousness was growing in the Russian Empire, as it was in the other empires of Europe, and he was far from the only Ukrainian tackling the issue of Rus. After all, it is hard to build a national identity without an origin story. But not all of them were anti-Normanists. Omelian Partitsky, who lived from 1840 to 1895, was a linguist and historian born in Kiev, and like Khrushchevsky, he ended up working in Lviv. He had considerable talent as a linguist, publishing a 35,000-word German-Ukrainian dictionary at just 27 years of age, as well as Ukrainian language and literature textbooks for schools, and generally promoting education in Ukrainian. Notably, this was in parallel to the order of prohibition banning education in Ukrainian in the Russian-controlled part of Ukraine. His work, Skandinavshchina v Davnyi Rusi, Scandinavism in Ancient Rus, was published in a Galician newspaper called Dilo. Dilo, Ukrainian for deed, had been established in opposition to a Russophile newspaper called Slova, Russian for word. After serialization in the newspaper, it was published as a book in 1887. The book analyzed personal names, the names of peoples and place names, compared Slavic and Germanic aspects of Rus lore and mythology, and provided his conclusions as to the Scandinavian origin of Rus. Partitsky examines the names of Rus leaders, princes, warriors, and ambassadors occurring in the various sources. The non-Slavic sound of many names is immediately apparent, even to a person who is unable to link them back to a Germanic origin. After analyzing 90 personal names, he concludes that all except 3, Sviatoslav, Volodislav, and Predslava, are Scandinavian. His examination of place names proposed Scandinavian origins for words that had previously not had an etymological explanation. For instance, the tale of bygone years refers to the Golden Horn of Constantinople as the Sud, which had stumped scholars for years. Partitsky derives the word from the Scandinavian word for straits, sund. The und ending is not characteristic of Slavic phonology, so the n sound was gradually dropped. He explains the old name for Kiev, Sambat, as coming from Sam, together, and Bat, boat, a meeting place for boats. He found similarly plausible derivations for the Scandinavian place names used in De Administranda Imperio. Denis Zubritsky was another Ukrainian Normanist. He was born in 1777 near what was then Lemberg and now Lviv. In the partition of Poland, it became part of the Austrian Empire, but was still Polish-dominated in a cultural sense. He was a Polish speaker and produced his first works in Polish, as well as dabbling in what was called jazycie. I'm probably putting the stress wrong on that as I don't speak Polish, loosely meaning slang or jargon. It was a blend of Polish and Ukrainian used in Galicia at the time. He had an epiphany after encounters with Ukrainian oral folk traditions, going on to gather and publish a collection of Galician folk songs, and then writing the history of ancient Halicina Rus. We haven't got into it yet, so just note that Halicina is the Ukrainian for Galicia, and was one of the principalities of ancient Rus that encompassed what is now western Ukraine. The first volume dealt with the origins of the Rus kings and princes, who he saw as Varangians, descended from Rurik. Stepan Tomaszewski was a student of Hrushevsky and another player in Ukraine's attempts to become an independent country as the empires of Europe collapsed. In his case, he was a member of the Ukrainian National Democratic Party and active in the declaration of the Western Ukrainian National Republic, which broke away from the disintegrating Austro-Hungarian Empire as the Ukrainian People's Republic broke away from Russia. In January 1919, the two were joined together, but although less than 25% of the population was Polish and more than 60% was Ukrainian, Poland claimed and occupied its territory. The government of the UPR decided the pragmatic solution was to trade its territory to Poland in exchange for an alliance against Soviet Russia. Tomaszewski wrote a number of books on Ukrainian history, including An Introduction to the History of the Church in Ukraine, Vatican Materials on the History of Ukraine, and A History of Ukraine, Ancient and Medieval Times. In 1929, he published his New Theory on the Origins of Rus, which sees the emergence of Rus as based on three struggles: against the steppe nomads, against Poland, which also represents the East-West opposition, and against Muscovy, which represents a North-South opposition. Tomaszewski supported the Norse origins of Rus and argued that Ukrainian national culture and independence was created through separation from a Rus self-identity. Although Tomaszewski followed Hrushevsky in many of his ideas on the development of Ukraine as an independent people, it is interesting how completely they oppose each other on the early origins. For Hrushevsky, Rus was entirely Ukrainian, originating out of the Slavic people who were the indigenous population of the region, without foreign contribution. As such, Rus belongs to Ukraine and is its sole heritage. For Tomaszewski, Rus is external and something from which Ukraine should separate itself. In Soviet times, ideology and censorship were added to the burdens of imperialism and nationalism on theories of Rus. The communist government directly instructed historians to produce history that justified Slavic, and particularly Russian, primacy. This reached a crescendo during World War II, when Boris Grekov declared that, quote, "The Norman thesis is the work of fascist falsifiers of history," end quote. The fascists actually did approve of the Norman theory. Hitler contributed to the debate with the opinion that, quote, "Unless other peoples, beginning with the Vikings, had imported some rudiments of organization into Russia, the Russians would be living like rabbits," end quote. Mikhailo Braichevsky was an historian who wrote and contributed to numerous works on the origins of the Slavs and Rus. He was expelled from the Academy of Sciences in 1968 for writing Occupation or Unification, a work criticizing the Orthodox Soviet view of Ukrainian development, and was only allowed to return more than a decade later. Braichevsky attacked Normanists for treating the Slavs as a faceless inert mass against which Scandinavian actors created Rus. Where, he asked, did this mass without nationality or statehood come from? He saw the assumptions of the Normanists as an impediment to answering this question. Petro Tolochko, another Ukrainian historian involved in politics as a legislator and member of Yulia Tymoshenko's Fatherland Party, has written extensively on the subject of Rus, in titles such as Ancient Kiev, From Rus to Ukraine, Kievan Rus, Nomadic Peoples of the Steppe and Kievan Rus, and many more. His view takes a somewhat different angle to the historians we have already mentioned. For him, Slavic Rus and Scandinavia in the 9th to 11th centuries were equal partners. They both sent each other trade representatives and embassies. Although the Scandinavians were fearsome warriors and militarily successful in the east as they were pretty much everywhere else they landed, Scandinavia and Rus were at a similar level of socio-cultural development. Therefore, there were no grounds to treat the Scandinavians as prestigious or superior. Rus artisans, for instance, did not copy Scandinavian designs. No, for Tolochko, the defining external influence was Byzantium, which was at an incomparably higher level of development to both Rus and Scandinavia, and had a far greater impact and influence on Rus. He concludes that, quote, "Neither written nor archaeological sources give any basis to see in the Varangians a force that would cause a significant influence on the formation process of the socio-political and socio-economic development of Eastern Slavs. The Varangians, who arrived in Rus in small numbers, merged into the existing social structures that had been developing since long before their arrival independently of them." End quote. Ukrainian historians elsewhere in the world have likewise produced varying viewpoints on the Rus. Yet another political historian, Dmytro Doroshenko, was a member of the Ukrainian Central Rada in the newly declared People's Republic. He supported the conservative coup by General Pavlo Skoropadsky, becoming foreign minister in his new government, but resigned shortly after. Going into exile in 1919, he ended up teaching history in Canada. In his history of Ukraine, he wrote that Rus was the name of a foreign tribe that took control of the southern East Slavic tribes. They triggered the formation of the Rus state, but then disappeared, leaving nothing but the name behind them. Omelian Pritsak, born in the short-lived Western Ukrainian National Republic, an exile from Soviet Ukraine, and later the founder of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, studied under a man named Ahatenhel Krymsky. Krymsky was the son of a Tatar father and a Polish mother. He identified as a Crimean Tatar, but he got his name Krymsky, Russian for Crimean, as the result of an ancestor converting to Christianity. He called himself a Ukrainophile and was arrested as a Ukrainian nationalist in 1941, Convicted of anti-Soviet nationalist activities and sentenced to imprisonment near Kostanay in Kazakhstan, where he died, possibly under torture. Krymsky was what was then called an Orientalist. He graduated from the Lazarev Institute of Oriental Languages and later taught Arabic literature. He was fluent in 34 languages and had a working knowledge of more than 50. He contributed numerous articles to Russian encyclopedias and wrote histories of the Arabs, Turkey and Persia, as well as works on their literature, dervishes and the Semitic peoples, some of which were the first of their kind in Russian. He also wrote books on the Turkic peoples in Ukrainian and headed the Turkological Commission of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. He spent a considerable part of his later life working on a 6-volume history of the Khazars, which was sadly never published. Prytsak's background introduced an element that listeners of this podcast will already be familiar with, but which is often discounted, ignored, or treated with outright hostility when considering the origins of Rus, the influence of the steppe. For Prytsak, rather than being brought from the west to the Slavs, statehood came from both east and west, as merchants from each encountered each other on the Volga and created Rus, with the northern part under Germanic domination and the southern part under Turkic. So where does that leave the Slavs? Prytsak did not believe in the Slavic origins of Rus. In his view, the Polyanians were also Khazars. He takes the letter from a Khazar Jewish writer in Kiev that we've previously referenced as evidence of the Khazar presence in Kiev. A reference in the tale of bygone years to a part of the city known as Kozare is a reference to the Khazars. Kiev itself is the western outpost of Khazaria, built by a Khazar commander called Kuya. The Ukhorski district of Kiev got its name from the Onegors, and so on. In this telling, it is no surprise that the early printers of Kiev were calling themselves Kagan rather than a Scandinavian or Slavic term. It is into this territory that the Normans come, freeing the Severanians from paying tribute to the Khazars, taking over Kiev, ultimately causing the downfall of the Khaganate and expanding their domination. Prytsak surveys the evidence for Scandinavians in Eastern Europe and finds plenty. He also finds the Khazar influence on the Norsemen too, such as the idea of divinely appointed leaders and changes in their writing to better adapt it for communication with outside communities. In this view of Rus, ethnicity matters little. Normans, Khazars, Balts, Finns, Slavs, they're all there in a great multi-ethnic, multilingual confederation controlling the rich trade of Eastern Europe. While I think it is perfectly obvious to all of you why the place of Rus in the history of Ukraine is such a vital issue, it is no less so for Russia. How Russia relates to Rus is a subject that will not be coming up in the podcast for a while yet, but Kiev's place is not in question, no matter what your theory of Rus is. But Ukrainians and Russians are not the only ones concerned with Rus. Polish historians have also had a keen interest in Rus, both because of how intertwined their history has been with Ukraine and Russia, and more generally because of their own interest in Slavic origins. And of course, it is natural for the Scandinavians to also have their view on their contribution to history. Henryk Lovmiański was a prominent 20th century Polish historian, author of a 6-volume work titled The Beginnings of Poland, and a book called The Problem of the Normans and the Genesis of Slavic States. To him, attempts to derive Rus from Ruotsi ran way over the linguistic touchline, and there was no reason why they should not have appeared independently. He wondered whether the Scandinavian root word for red, rausch, could be linked to Rusi, the Slavic word for auburn reddish-brown hair. He sees no reason to consider Rus something foreign. Rather, it was the place name for the Middle Dnieper, which was adopted by the people who formed a state there, and thus became a term for those people. He admits the multi-ethnic nature of the Rus, incorporating Slavic, Scandinavian, and Finnic elements, but believed that the Slavs were dominant. Henryk Paszkiewicz was a historian and author of a work called Origins of Russia. Very much a Normanist, he treated the Varangians as the deciding factor in the emergence of Rus. Paszkiewicz has no time for merely implying that the Eastern Slavs were incapable of self-organization. He comes right out and says it. Commenting on the Anti-Normanists, he writes, quote, "One often encounters the theory that the Eastern Slavs, before the arrival of the Norsemen, had already formed wide political organizations. Unfortunately, the sources lend no justification for such conjecture, and know no term with which to define a supratribal entity. The so-called Dulibian League, so frequently quoted in this connection, is a fiction. Nestor," and he puts the name in quotes in case you're not sure of his attitude to the alleged author of The Tale of Bygone Years, under the year 859, divides the Slavonic tribes into two groups, one northern and one southern, but only in connection with their dependence on foreign invaders, the Varangians and the Khazars. End quote. A century earlier, another Pole, Józef Sikorski, a professor at St. Petersburg University, member of the Academy of Sciences, novelist and traveller who wrote memoirs on his journeys to Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, read a short booklet by a Danish historian, Carl Christian Raffen, commenting on the Aemon de Ruther, a Norse saga describing the adventures of Varangians serving Yaroslav the Wise. Sikorski plunged into studying Old Norse and producing articles on the saga. He wrote a comparison of the Tale of Bygone Years and the Aemon de Ruther, then a translation of the saga with extensive commentaries. He decided that not only had the Scandinavians taken control of the Slavs and Finns, they had completely altered their customs and traditions. This influence was so total, he claimed, that the Zaporizhian Cossacks of what he called Dnieprian Scandinavian Rus were still speaking a Scandinavian language. I should note here that he's talking about the Cossacks of the 16th, 17th centuries, and this is complete nonsense. Despite the, shall we say, lack of rigor in his work, Sikorski's publications were popular and stimulated the study of connections between the Norse sagas and the Rus. The interest got as far as the Minister for Public Education, Uvarov, who coordinated the opening of a Rus section at the Nordic Antiquarian Society in Copenhagen. The section brought together leading scholars from Scandinavia, who translated sagas into Russian and carried out textual analysis, resulting in the publication of the Rus Antiquities in Icelandic and Ancient Scandinavian Historical Monuments, containing texts and analysis of passages from the Poetic Edda, Snorre Edda, other sagas and tales of voyages, as well as treaties between the Scandinavian kings and Novgorod. Despite the popularity of Varangian themes and eventual imperial approval, the Normanist theory was as controversial in Russia as it was elsewhere. With the dominance of non-Russian scholars in the Academy of Sciences when the German historians began presenting their theories, the debate took on nationalistic elements, which would continue with a new overlay of Marxist-Leninist thought in the 20th century. The scholar who got it all started, Gottlieb Siegfried Bayer, arrived in Russia in 1725. Just 32, he was already a noted philologist and historian, and is regarded as the founder of the Normanist school. He made his initial conclusions based on linguistic analysis, comparing Russian and Scandinavian names and other terms, and drawing on the De Administrando Imperium to support the tale of bygone years. His works on the Varangians, on the origins of Rus, and the geography of Rus and neighbouring regions, according to northern writers, assumed that every aspect of the formation of Rus came from the Normans. Although Tatashev incorporated some of Bayer's ideas into his History of Russia, he criticized his bias, saying that he robbed the Russian people of virtue and desired to enlarge Prussian possessions at the expense of Russia. Mikhail Lomonosov, a legendary Russian polymath who founded Moscow State University and produced groundbreaking work in physics, chemistry, astronomy, geology, and geography, as well as literary theory and history, was on the commission that Elizabeth Petrovna appointed to investigate Muller. Lomonosov strongly opposed the German historians. He was a patriot who saw history as vital to forming the national consciousness and identity. In his Ancient Russian History, he identifies the Sarmatians as the forerunners of the Slavs and Balts, and derives the name Rus from the Roxolani. His Varangians are multi-ethnic northern soldier bands of Slavic Sarmatians and Balts. In this case, it was easy for the Varangian Rurik to take over at Novgorod, because these Rus were already closely related to the local Slavs. Other 18th and 19th century Russian historians argued, like their Ukrainian counterparts, that the Slavs had not been behind the rest of medieval Europe, and therefore the Scandinavians they came into contact with would not have been more advanced than they were. Novgorod and Kiev were already self-governing states and had no need of a foreign injection of statehood. For Russian history, the 19th century began with Nikolai Karamzin, writer of an enormous 12-volume The History of the Russian State. Following Tatishev's attempt at a first true history of Russia, Karamzin is sometimes regarded as the father of Russian history. Praised not only for his detail and command of his subject, he was an outstanding literary stylist who created a clear structure in his work. But on the flip side, he was a staunch conservative and opponent of reform, who saw autocracy and the Tsar as the be-all and end-all of a gloriously imperial Russia, leading to his history being referred to as the Epic of Despotism. As autocracy was the linchpin of Russian statehood, Karamzin's periodization of Russian history depended on the development of that autocracy. Everything that came before it was prehistory, so there was no Russian history until the Varangians were invited to come and create a Russian state. He calls Rurik the first Russian autocrat. At the time, Karamzin saw Russia as a blend of East and West, and commented on the Norman controversy thus: the difference, he means, between Normanists and Anti-Normanists had great bearing on Russian politics, where the attitude to the institutions and ideas of the West is always a touchstone by which one can often distinguish the true Russian conservative from an extreme reactionary. Karamzin's successor as the leading Russian historian of his time was Mikhail Petrovich Pogodin, the son of a serf whose owner, Count Stroganov, procured him a place at Moscow University. He skipped his meals to spend his student stipend on Karamzin's histories. At this time, the government was coming to realize the value of an official history, and following the Polish uprising of 1830 to 1831, Nicholas I's education minister, Count Uvarov, was tasked with finding ways to suppress Slavic national consciousness and promote Russianness. Pogodin's job was supposed to be writing a book to justify the assimilation of the Western territories into the empire, but he missed his brief. As a Slavophile, Pogodin took great interest in the Ukrainians and saw them as culturally distinct from Russians. He thought the Russian and Ukrainian languages had already diverged by early Kievan times and matched the situation in his day, with Kiev, Chernihiv, and Halych speaking Ukrainian, while Moscow and Vladimir spoke Russian. But after the arrest of Mykola Kostomarov, a fellow Slavophile and pro-Ukrainian historian, Pogodin shifted his position and began claiming that the tale of bygone years was only related to Russian, with no Ukrainian influence. For the rest of his life, Pogodin argued with Kostomarov over the origin of the Rus. Pogodin was a staunch Normanist, asserting that the Rus came from Roslagen in Sweden, and they brought Russians from the north down into Kiev, where they dominated the Ukrainian tribes. Kostomarov rejected the Scandinavian origin of Rus and argued for a Lithuanian origin. Their arguments contributed to the entrenchment of Normanist and anti-Normanist positions. After a public debate between them at Moscow University, Prince Pyotr Vyazemsky commented, quote, "If we didn't know which way we were going before, now we don't know where we are coming from either." In the second half of the 19th century, Vasily Kluchevsky introduced new considerations to Russian history for the first time: economics, trade, finance, population, and competition between cities. He saw the development of a strong central state and colonization as the distinguishing features of Russian history. For Kluchevsky, first came the city-states, Novgorod, Kiev, Suzdal, and others, which were the centers of their regions. Then came the Grand Duchy of Kiev, in which the other ancient cities became its administrative units. The Varangians entered as commercial partners, but became the military rulers of the cities they protected, with the title of knyaz, duke or prince, deriving from the Norse konung. Other historians continued to tackle the issue of place names into the 20th century. Yevgenia Rydzewskaya concluded that Holmgartha and Gatharika, the allegedly Scandinavian names for Novgorod and Rus, were not in fact Scandinavian, and did not mean city on the island and land of cities, as they were usually rendered. She also decided that Rus was not Scandinavian. In her opinion, Rus only entered usage as a place and ethnic name from the 13th century onwards. She began work on the use of Rus, Ros in place names, finding them widely distributed in the Dnieper and Pontic steppe, but absent in the Upper Volga and Ladoga regions. Her analysis of place names in Novgorod territory cast doubt on their Scandinavian origins and on Norman colonization. She believed that Scandinavians in the East were only a very narrow warrior class. Other peoples came into contact with this warrior class and mistakenly identified them with the wider population. She died in the siege of Leningrad with her work unfinished. The Soviet era brought new considerations to theories of Rus as well. According to the Marxist-Leninist position, the state appeared due to the evolution of economic and social conditions. Major changes did not happen overnight. The Academy of Sciences and universities were full of the same old scholars as before the revolution, who continued to elaborate their existing theories. Alexei Shakhmatov was a Russian linguist and historian who aimed to carry out a complete historical analysis of the tale of bygone years, determining the correspondence of each part to actual historical events and the contemporary factors influencing how it was written, to enable accurate interpretation of the author's intent. In the course of his work, he concluded that Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian had developed as separate languages from the original Old Slavic, which was anathema to Russian nationalists who insisted that Ukrainian and Belarusian were mere dialects of Russian. Shakhmatov attempted to resolve the contradictions in the tale of bygone years and other contemporary sources by postulating three Scandinavian states, with Rus appearing as the result of competition among them. First, the Normans established Old Rus in the region around Lake Ilmen, which he equated to the Rus Khaganate mentioned in the sources. Then, a few decades later, other Normans moved into the Dnieper region and founded a state based on Kiev. A few decades after that, the Slavic tribes in the northeast rebelled, expelled those Normans, and invited in the new Varangians. All the Normans then fought each other until the lands were united into a single Varangian state with its center in Kiev. In this telling, the name Rus again comes from the Finnish word ruotsi for Swedes. His theory of three Scandinavian states were the first arising on Lake Ilmen before Novgorod was rejected by other leading historians who found it overcomplicated and lacking in support outside of the textual sources. In the 1920s, Pavel Smirnov wrote The Volga Route and the Ancient Rus, drawing mainly on Islamic sources to claim that Rus had appeared not on the way from Scandinavia to Byzantium, which had essentially been the only theory advanced so far, but on the route from the Baltic to the Caspian. This Rus on the Volga was the Rus Khaganate. In this theory, the Rus were driven back to Novgorod by the rising power of the Magyars. Like Shakhmatov, Smirnov did not find much support for his original approach to resolving the conflict with contemporary sources. At the beginning of the 1930s, Veniamin Brim proposed a new derivation of the term Rus. Although accepting the Ruotsi to Rus transition, he argued that Ruotsi, which was usually passed as something like oarsmen, was actually derived from the Norse word drot, the chieftain's retinue, the comitatus, or as the Slavs would say, the druzhina. Therefore, rather than being an ethnic name, it was simply how the bands of Scandinavian warriors described themselves. Brim also accepted the widespread existence of the local term Rus in Ukraine and southern Russia, and therefore asserted that the name Rus had appeared as a merging of the two terms, Rus and Ros. But by the 1930s, everything was changing. The Normanist theory was declared unacceptable and became even less so after the Second World War broke out. In the journal Bolshevik, on 30th November 1947, it was denounced as, quote, politically harmful because it denies the ability of the Slavic nations to form an independent state by their own efforts, end quote. The early chroniclers were dismissed as biased propagandists. Archaeological excavations were used to minimize the Varangian presence in Kiev and claimed that Rus was solely the work of the Slavs. Serafim Yushkov argued that the Rus were a social group, the retinue of the knyaz, charged with military and foreign trade tasks. They were originally Slavs, but may have hired some Scandinavians, which led to the confusion of Byzantine and Islamic writers. Other scholars admitted that the Varangians had been an elite in Novgorod, but asserted Slavic dominance in Kiev. Oleg Trubachev, a leading Soviet linguist who we've already mentioned in previous episodes, also supported the derivation of Rus from the river Ros. His work, River Names of Right Bank Ukraine, analyzed the large numbers of rivers with names ending in s, finding Ros, Rs, Rus, Urs, Rois, Rossa, and other similar names across the region. Outside Russia, George Vernadsky, born Georgy in St. Petersburg, who had gone into exile after the Civil War and eventually ended up as professor of Russian history at Yale, was one of the exiled Russian historians who formulated the Eurasianist theory of Russian history. In keeping with this theory, although he accepted that the Norsemen could have been absorbed by the Slavs, he saw the Rus as coming from the Alans, and meaning light from the Rukh in Roxolani. He also divided the Rus into a separate Rus Khaganate on the Don and a later Rus, founded by Rurik. Swedish archaeologist Ture Arna published Sweden and the East in 1914, in which he claims extensive Norman colonization throughout Eastern Europe, from the Iron Age to the Viking era. The book was widely influential when it came out, particularly among historians who were taking a linguistic approach to proving the Scandinavian presence around Novgorod and Lake Ladoga. But the extensive archaeological work carried out in the Soviet Union led to some pushback, as others argued that trade did not necessarily mean colonization, and that barrow graves in the region, which Arna treated as Scandinavian, contained few Viking grave goods and were more likely only evidence of cultural influence rather than direct presence. In the mid-20th century, Holger Arbman studied Swedish travels to the east and south, but although a convinced Normanist, He admits that there was scant archaeological evidence. To him, this does not mean it is not there, but rather that it has not yet been found. He also accepts that although the tale of bygone years is the foundation of Normanist theory, no one knows who wrote it, bits are missing, and it doesn't provide any information about the period before Rurik. German historians in the second half of the 20th century have seen the Scandinavian influence on Rus as significant but short term. They may have founded some of the towns, but they were swiftly absorbed into local populations. The eastern trade route may not even have involved extensive travel to the Black Sea. The Varangians may merely have extracted tribute from the Slavic population. The overall picture is of the Varangians as merely one element of the historical forces contributing to the emergence of Rus. Thomas Noonan is worth another mention at this point, but as I have already referred to him frequently in the episodes on the Khazars, I'll just briefly remind you that in contrast to the opinion just mentioned, his analysis of the coins found throughout northern Russia and the Baltic supports the idea of large-scale trade between Scandinavia and the Black Sea Caspian region. And his conceptualization of the Rus is another one that renders the idea of Normans colonizing the East more or less irrelevant, as the multi-ethnic, multilingual trade complex covering the region and the struggle to dominate it becomes the key factor driving the development of Rus. Another archaeologist who made an important contribution in recent times is Norway's Anne Stalsberg. Stalsberg concentrates on items such as jewelry, providing evidence of a Scandinavian female presence in Eastern Europe. She has identified 60% of Scandinavian graves in Rus territory, dated to around 800 to 1000 CE, as containing women. The presence of women allows inferences to be made about the Scandinavian presence. A situation where they were moving into the area as entire families is different to one where they are warriors taking service. The amount of their goods that are local compared to Scandinavian can also be used as an indicator of how close their relations with their home country were. So where does that leave us? Pretty much where we've been for the last 250 years. You can believe that the Normans created Rus, or you can believe that the Slavs created Rus, or you can believe that it was a huge East European trade complex in which ethnicity didn't really matter. The proponents of each position present their findings as fact and viciously deride their opponents. Imperialist and nationalist narratives also continue to play a role. For some Ukrainians, Rus is Ukraine and Ukraine is Rus, and no one else has any part in its heritage, certainly not Russians. Worse, we have returned to the days when the Russian Empire tried to write Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Poles out of the story and present Rus as just a step on the way towards Russia, or when the Soviet Union was trying to present the Slavs as a unique people naturally predisposed to collectivism and communism. Putin has once again declared that Ukrainians do not exist. They are merely Russians speaking a Russian dialect, and Russian school textbooks are being rewritten to remove all mention of Ukraine, claiming the ancient Rus state as only a stage in the development of Russia. In his inaugural lecture on the origin of Rus at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, Omelian Pritsak quoted British archaeologist David Wilson. In England, the only town to yield really convincing Viking antiquities in any quantity is York, and even this number has been exaggerated. Structures from the Anglo-Danish period are rarely found in York. Even those that have been are not specifically Viking in character. The other Viking towns in England have produced hardly any Viking antiquities, yet we know the Vikings were there. End quote. I've seen this quote used in a couple of papers with opposite interpretations, but maybe we can take it as meaning that we just have to accept the same about the Varangians of Rus. After all, this is not the first case like this that we've encountered in this podcast. and not even the only one relevant to Rus itself. As we've discussed, there is no reference to people called Slavs or people speaking Slavic before the 6th century. 400 years earlier, the Romans knew about the Finns and described Scandinavia, but they found no Slavs to discuss between the Balkans and the Baltic. Historians will say that the Antes and others were Slavs, but no contemporary calls them that. Yet one day we find Slavs, without any sign of them having migrated from somewhere. We just know they were there. Although evidence continues to accumulate as archaeologists bring new discoveries to light, and now we have genetic research to draw on as well, it is quite probable that we will never know for sure how Rus appeared. But as far as our story going forwards, if you've been paying attention throughout the recent episodes, you might have guessed that my position is probably going to be closest to Pritsak and Noonan. Scandinavians and trade routes played a key role in the development of Rus, and also of Volga Bulgaria, another medieval state where you could easily find Varangians. And so did the Finno-Ugrians and other neighbours of the Slavs. The Khazars certainly played a role, maybe not quite to the extent Pritsak argues, but we've already seen the overlooked steppe influence on Europe in this podcast many times. We know why it's not usually taken into consideration. When Bayer sat down to consider the role of the Normans in the creation of Rus back in the 1700s, do you think he gave any thought to what a bunch of Asian nomads were doing? Yeah, me neither. The majority of books I have read on early Rus, especially if we're talking about single-volume histories of Russia or Ukraine, will usually say something in passing about the Slavs teaching the non-Slavic peoples of the plain agriculture. As we know, this never happened. The archaeological record shows that on the eve of the emergence of Rus, the nomads settling in the western steppe and on the middle Volga had more advanced agriculture and metallurgy than their Slav neighbors. It's simply an assumption that the sedentary people were more advanced and that knowledge flowed from west to east. It's the same assumption that the people doing the assuming complain about when the assumption is that the Scandinavians were more advanced than the Slavs. But I'm not here to dishonor the Slavs, as the early opponents of Normanism would say. That question simply doesn't stand. Even if we accept that the Slavs did not form a state before their interaction with the Avars, Khazars, and Scandinavians, it's not because they were incapable, but only because the necessary circumstances and stimuli for them to do so had not appeared. So I also take the position that ethnicity is irrelevant to this issue. Whoever was involved, and whatever their contributions, Khazars, Swedes, Finns, Balts, or Slavs, what we know for sure is that the end result was a Rus of peoples who spoke Slavic languages and called themselves Slavs. Join me next time as we travel to the northern forests and look at the first Scandinavian incursions into the east. Thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.